Nancy. And, it's, she's always, everyone in our family are entertainers and they're all a part of the entertainment industry. So we all kind of have our different niches and pockets that we're in. And my Aunt Monique is out in Toronto in Canada, and she's actually done a lot of work out there to elevate and amplify Native people and their work in theater specifically. Some of the things, you might know, she's my Aunt Gloria, my great Aunt Gloria's, or my Aunt Gloda's daughter. And she's done a lot of pieces. She's Princess Pocahontas is one of the pieces that she's written, as well as the Blue Spots. And, we're going to talk a little bit today about all of the many different types of work that she's done, the many different mediums that she's a part of, and her career, and, kind of what she's headed into now, where she was, and what she's into now. So I'm very excited to talk to her today. I think we're going to have a good time. We always have good conversations. My Aunt Monique is someone who me and my family, we go to for advice a lot. My fiance always thinks it's funny. He's like, "Oh, you're talking to Aunt Monique, so something must have happened," because every time something happens, that's always who we talk to. And so a little bit, I think to get started, let's talk about some of your earlier works, right? When you first got to Toronto, and how those kind of came to be, and what even was like the very like baby steps of those beginning processes of creating a show, or even the idea, and how do you take that seed and let it grow and nourish it to grow into something larger than just the idea.
First of all, Nuedi, Negambi, that question, the first step, I came to Toronto at a time, something's hissing.
What was that mean?
I don't know. Something's overheating, maybe? I don't know. I came to Toronto right prior to what's referred to here as the Native Theatre Explosion, 1982. And it was the beginning at that time of a company called Native Earth Performing Arts. And previously to that, I'd been in a small Native company at the Native American Center for the Living Arts in Niagara Falls, also known as the Turtle. It was called Indian Time Theater. And prior to that in university, and also had very much the privilege of being around and trained by our family in Spider Woman Theater. In the mid-70s, when I was in university, is when they were formed, and I got to be in rehearsals and be in workshops and watch them and understand how they were creating, the process of creating from a collective and from the body. And previous to that, my mother put me in every single arts, dance, theater, music bursary that she could get for a little brown girl in New York City. So I was a really busy kid, started training at age 3. And at that time, in 1983, when I moved to Toronto, the first step, when I was for that year and a half the AD of Native Earth Performing Arts, was to bring your Meemaw here, was to bring that process of creating from a seed, from an idea, from stories, from the stories that we have in our bodies, from the stories that we hear, from the stories that we collect, the stories that we breathe, to a group of emerging Indigenous artists, so that we could get those stories on their feet. And the first 2 pieces when I was at Native Earth as AD were directed by your grandma Muriel Miguel. They were Double Take a Second Look, and the other one was Give Them a Carrot for as Long as the Sun is Green, which was sort of our take on Waiting for Godot.
Trying to unmute myself real quick. I think that was my thing hissing. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think it's really interesting that everybody in our family, um, we all come, our family, as far as like, my grandmother is Muriel Miguel, her mother is Gloria Miguel, and I've always been around Spider Woman theater and the way that they create, right? And I think it's really interesting because it's almost like all of us have our experience of working with Spider Woman theater, right? And I was writing a grant today, and we were talking about storytelling and why storytelling is like necessary, or why theater is necessary. But I think for us and our understanding, I think a lot of the times is that storytelling, and which goes into different techniques of story weaving and how Spider Woman creates pieces, but storytelling is I think it's a role that we take very seriously in this family, and I think we take it with the seriousness that it's not a burden, but it's almost like we are carrying something by telling these stories, right? And we understand the severity of it and what that means to our community. And so I think it's really interesting that all of us always kind of, it's almost as if story weaving and the way that Spider Woman develops pieces are almost like our grounding for how we're able to approach more work after that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's almost like it's our base level. And of course, right, like with classes and taking all types of these, and I think that's a thing, like our families have always done, you know what I mean? They want to make sure that, I guess we're a family of artists who are very invested in nourishment of our youth in the family and into becoming artists. And so if you it's very interesting sometimes to look at it, because it's like, wow, we really all are artists, like doing our own thing, and it's very interesting, and it's really beautiful to, of course, be a part of. But I think going from that, how would you say that, Spider Woman theater techniques and story weaving, how that has influenced your journey, I think, as an actress and as an artist, right? And how you were able to make those transitions from the way that we work with Spider Woman into something let's say is like super linear, right? Not that everything is done super, but sometimes when you get these higher gigs, right, you get these super kind of linear situations. And so how are you able to kind of, translate that for yourself to be embodied in these pieces, right? Or these roles?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I've ever really taken that apart. First, let me put that on pause, because I want to go back to what you were saying about family and the responsibility of stories, because I would go back one more generation to my grandparents and your great grandparents who were performing in the New York City area in the 20s and 30s. And a lot of what Spider Woman did was in response to having been in those kids, like more my mom and Aunt Elizabeth than your mom, that age, that when she was old enough to be doing that, they were changing, how they wanted to be perceived in a way that allowed them more agency. But I would go back to that generation and the fact that my grandparents, your great grandparents, sort of established an indigenous community, or what became the urban indigenous community in New York City at that time. So understanding that and understanding the responsibility of those stories, the stories that we know in our bodies that we weren't there to witness. One of the things that's important about those stories is that when I explain to somebody about asking permission, even if there's a story that I've heard all my life and I've heard it recounted through the two generations before me, I always feel like I need to ask the permission, even if I'm just asking my mom, is it okay that I tell this story? I wasn't there when it happened. I was under grandma's dining room table listening to the stories being talked about from a time where I wasn't born yet. Can I tell this? And I think that's an important sort of differentiation from mainstream or non-indigenous Euro descendant folks who are based much more on extraction. What can we mine? What can we take? It's out there. It's universal. That stories belong to families, that stories are collectively held, that stories can be collectively private. So a lot of what I've examined and have been examining as I work as a dramaturg and other Indigenous artists' work was, so what do we do so that we protect the sacredness of a story? What do we do that we protect the privacy of a story, either to an individual or to a family or to a community or to a culture? So what are those things that you engage so that those things that are held collectively private stay collectively private, and those things that we are just thirsty to get in and examine and talk about can be released? Now I forgot what you asked me because I wanted to go back and catch that.
No,
Tell
and
me
no,
again
it's
what you
okay. No,
asked
but
me.
I think I was just, we
Oh,
were talking
linear.
really about the transition, right, from that.
Right.
But I do like
Right.
what you're talking about when talking about going that step further back in the generation, because you are so right. That is where it began, right? And if it wasn't for, like, my great grandmother Ella, and then, even before then, or my great grandfather Tony, like, there, and on my father's side, and Bean and Moss, there's so many influences of, you're right, upholding that community with storytelling. And I guess we're very lucky in a sense sometimes, I feel, because that, even though there are so many parts of theater, and I think especially when you think about like Western European theater, that it can be really kind of like scary because of, like, and it's very interesting because my introduction, and I'm sure you may feel the same, but a lot of, like, as far as my generation, my introduction to theater has always been this community base, right? It has always been within the spectrum of this type of storytelling and the responsibility of it, right? Which is true because you're always teetering that kind of balance as a Native person over, like, how much can you share and how much is oversharing, and whose information and whose stories are you oversharing, and what is yours to tell. But that's right. But what I was asking about was just the string, was saying how, when you enjoy working this way, right? And it's like, and this is the way that you are most comfortable working, and you feel is the best, is what works for you as far as being embodied, right? And that's a big thing that we talk about, I think, with story weaving and the type of work, as far as Spider Woman and any offshoots of the type of theater from that is embodied, right? Because so many times, like, it's really about what is already inside of you and what is living inside of you. And what I was wondering is, how do you make the transition, let's say, for some smaller, I shouldn't say smaller roles, but it's not smaller roles, but there's the what you create, and then there's a linear job,
a hired gun, right? Being a hired gun.
Yeah, how do you do that transition, right? Because sometimes, without being like, oh God, I hate all of this, although maybe it is that.
Sometimes it's that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that, and sometimes it's not possible because the constraints of a conventional theater are such that there's nowhere to go but learn your blocking, memorize your lines. We're going to do an Italian opening night. I find those really, really frustrating. Sometimes there's a way in. I always go back to those layers of the story weaving process where you're looking for impulse in the body. I always go back to the body. When there's a process where the body isn't taken into account, that's when I feel lost. But I've been able to always go back to what's the impulse, what's the gesture, how does the breath of that impulse and gesture lie on the words. I found that particularly useful when doing Shakespeare, because you can do that with Shakespeare. It's a little harder when people are doing those kinds of very linear, well-made play kinds of things. And I just find like a lot of times with that, I'm just waiting for it to be over. But sometimes, depending on who the director is and how skilled the director is, a lot of times, because the way that you work in the process where you're going for making that interior impulse exterior visible, it gets very abstract. So I find that I have to pull that in. If you're in a kitchen sink play and you're doing your repetition of your sound and movement, it looks weird, right? So you start there, you understand it, but you draw it back in till it gets to be back to that little kernel, instead of taking that and making it more expansive. It kind of goes the other way. I do that only internally and layer things on top. The layering is something I actually think that's very Kuna, and it comes from molas, and it comes from the many levels of multidimensionality, of the levels of reality in most indigenous cultures. But I remember going to see one of the first shows that my son Bear Witness did with his father, and I was walking through it with my friend Jill Carter, and we're looking at his video, and she goes, "He's layering," and he was doing that in an entirely different medium. He was doing it in the medium of video and music. So that layering is a real signature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And when you say it like that, in terms of like molas, and then thinking of the transition when it comes to layering and the creation of pieces and what Bear does, you can definitely see the reference to how things are layered upon layers, right? And how it's very interesting to talk to you about all this. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Take me out one more time, is all you said to me. And I swore
We're already kind of talking about that.
There, yeah. Nope.
Honestly, I don't do that much. Are we back?
Not yet.
Okay. I don't do that much conventional work. I mean, I do, but it's so boring, and it's so frustrating to be in it when it's like being in a straitjacket.
Hi, this is HENU Josephine Tarrant at USALA Media, and today we're talking to Monique MOJICA, who is my relative, my aunt, and we're just talking a little bit about her career. And I'm just going to kind of pick up where we left off. We were talking about, going from these very layered kind of embodied work into having to do something linear. We were just talking about how it's very difficult to do, and I totally agree. I'm definitely in agreement with you, because there is something that I think it's hard, because when we're talking about this layering and this embodied work, this is also really how we see the world and how we understand the world. So it can be very difficult to kind of have to, pull it into, like you said, like this, a kernel compared to what it actually really is for us, right? And I think, I don't even know if it's a family trait as much as it's just, I mean, you see it, I mean, as far as our family, yes, But I think when you look across Indigenous communities, you see that a lot, right? We don't just talk about, the sky with stars that are up at the night. We're thinking about the worlds that are within these stars, and that the worlds that live underground. And it's like sometimes I feel, even when, like, our families talk, or like when our families are together, like, like all together in one room, it's like the conversations just roll and roll and roll, because it's like I think it's how we understand things, right? It's everywhere, and it's very layered. It's really not just we're going to talk about what everyone's doing, what's the work that everyone's up to, what did everyone cook for the dinner. I mean, we're talking about like worldly issues, like what's going on with so and so, what about politics, and what about the rate. Like, there's all of these things that come up, and I feel even sometimes as an individual talking to people, that like sometimes people have trouble to keep up. And I'm sure you feel like they're like, what are you talking about? Like, how are we talking about ancestors? And like, I was in an acting class, and recently, like, that was something that came up. Was I was like, yeah, they're like, what's a moment with a song? And I was like, this moment makes me feel, when I listen to this song, like my ancestors are walking behind me, and I go on my daily walk, and like, like, of course, my acting teacher was cool with it, but I could tell a lot of people in the class were like, what? Like, how did this even get here? Like, I thought we were talking about a moment that happened in real life, but like for us,
That is real life.
Yeah, that's real life.
I do think that it is something that's specific to our family, but it comes from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the only other time that I was really aware of, oh, this is where it comes from, is when I was with our other side of our family in Panama City, right, in our Tio Francisco's home. This is the brother, Spider-Woman's brother. And I was traveling at that time with an Omushkego in Ehio Cree from James Bay, Erica Eiserhoff, who was there with me in Panama because she was the designer for my show, Chocolate Woman, Dreams of Milky Way. So if I'm talking textiles and molas, my costume designer needs to be a part of that research, right? Mm-hmm. So she came with me. And afterwards, a couple of visits there, she said, being in your family's living room is like being in a mola. And I said, what? What do you mean? She said, because there's all this cacophony going on all the time on all these different levels. There's the cats and dogs and chickens running around, and then there's the toddlers, and then there's the older kids that kept running in and sitting on your uncle's lap and going on, and he's there with his remote, and he's watching Yankees on TV, and then there's your cousins, the women who are talking across rooms, and cooking and getting the food. It's like a mola. And it shouldn't all go together, but it all happens at the same time. And I said, oh, okay, I understand that. And it was one of the times that made me understand the way that cultural information, cultural perception, how we see the world, how we're in the world, is encoded in those material things like textiles, like weavings, like quill work, like wampum belts, like our tattoos, like bark scrolls, like pottery, that all of those things carry that encoded way of seeing the world. So one of the things that I set out to do was to learn how to read a mola, even though I'd been around them all my life, and I was quite mature at the time that I first started this work in 2006. I couldn't read them. I couldn't look at a mola and say, well, this is why this is here. This is it. This design is an old geometric design. This design is a more contemporary representational. So my first step there was to become literate in that encoding. And to me, that's an intersection between the body literacy. We're talking about embodiment.
Yeah.
The body is text,
Right.
right? Which is something that Western theater doesn't really believe. And there's this whole thing about the mark of a civilized society is whether they have a written language and all of that. So, I mean, the body is text. There is body literacy. You have to know as a performer what the body says and how to make that respond, how to make your body respond as an actor, and how to elicit, how do you touch, how do you reach, how do you make that loop with your witnesses, with an audience. So there's a body literacy. There's also land literacy, land and place. Where are your people from? Because that energy and land forms a culture, forms your bodies, how we look, how we move, how we dance. How we dance on the land is also body literacy meets land literacy. So what's the intersection between those two? What I've been looking at is, and that relates to learning to read molas, wampum belts, land, is that there is pattern literacy, because all of those patterns mean something.
Yeah.
There's patterns in land, the way that energy moves in land, and what can you use from that is transferable to creating a structure for performance.
Yeah.
So putting those kinds of knowledges in the center of my practice is what I've been chasing down. Yeah. And lately what's been really exciting is being able to help guide, mentor, work with other Indigenous artists in finding their models from their culture. How they're going to, what's their architecture?
Right. That's what it is, right? Because we're all born with that. As Indigenous people, I mean, globally, we all are living, these patterns are inside of us, right? That's a very interesting way. So that goes into Chocolate Woman Dreams, the Milky Way, which is your piece that it's written by you and it created by you. And so what is kind of, when we're talking about the molas and pattern reading, what was at the base of it, right? Or what was just the movement of the land in Kunayala, the movement of the molas and family?
The first thing I did with that show was to learn what the aesthetic principles in a mola were. And I was really, really fortunate that I had two designers on that show. One was, as I mentioned, Erica Eiserhoff. The other was a Kuna visual artist named Oswaldo de Leon Cantule. And he, as a visual artist, had already been working for many years with having identified what the principles were. There were 4 principles of duality and repetition, abstraction, metaphor, and multidimensionality. So that's where we started and wove personal stories. Kind of complicated to say now. One of the names I carry is the name Olo Nadili. Olo Nadili was the youngest of the Nis Bundur, the daughters from the stars, who got left behind when the men misbehaved and they went back to the stars. The youngest daughter couldn't run fast enough and she got left. So I wove that cultural story with personal stories. But the shape and the way that I wove it was taken from the principles in molas, and it was written inspired by the pictographic writing from healing chants, from Kuna healing chants.
Wow.
And I created a movement score. Those chants are written right to left and back again. Like they never stop.
Mm-hmm.
And they're written in such a way with the healers, the chanters. Everyone has their own method, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not like a score in an orchestra where people are you given the score and you learn it from from reading the
Yeah.
music. You learn it in an embodied way. The people who
Uh,
apprentice to chanters learn it in an embodied way, and then when they've learned it, when they've been deemed graduated from
mm-hmm.
their apprenticeship, then they are presented with those pictographs, and it's more of a memory device
Mm-hmm.
than it is. You don't learn from it and remember from it. So I created a score on, I think I've got 23 sheets of banner paper with the pictographic score, which are movement um, triggers or things that make, but I can read that. I
Mm-hmm.
can read it. So my script was transcribed from the movement score into a conventional script form.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we've got the text
How did
is
you
there.
do that? You wrote it down movement by movement, or did you? Yeah.
I created pictographs,
Oh, okay.
right, that held the encoded story.
So you knew what.
So
So basically, you knew what it meant to. Oh, wow.
But it encoded the text and the movement.
Oh, wow.
And that we called. I must introduce the fact that we had with us the Kuna director, actor and director Jose Coleman,
Uh
and
huh.
he's from the island of Alicante, and he was for many many years the only Kuna theater artist in Panama. There are more now who have come after him, but I met him in Panama, and I was able to bring him to Canada to direct this piece. And he also, along with Oswaldo, acted as cultural consultant. So he was always there to say, well,
Mm-hmm.
and my mother, Gloria Miguel, was the other actor with me. So he was able to always bring us back to and ground us in Kuna culture. He says that he would say, okay, Gloria is telling this story and she's telling it in English while you're telling it in Dulegaya. She is the Sila, you are the Argar, and
Mm-hmm.
that is uh, the structure in which when they're speaking in this poetic way in the gathering house, the Silas speak in such a condensed, poetic, dense language that even if you only speak Kuna, Dulegaya, the community still needs somebody to translate that ceremonial language, and that's the Argar. So we had those structures and those principles all the way through. We had the repetition, we had the duality, we had two voices
Yeah.
all the time.
Which is
Different.
layering in itself,
Mm-hmm.
right there. Yeah, that's incredible. We're gonna hear some more about it. We're gonna take another quick break, and we'll be right back.
Right. Because there's also glasses that have that in, but because I have to have these on to see, I was thinking of getting one of the films. But there you can also get your prescription glasses with the blue thing in it.
That's what I have. Hello, everybody. HENU, Josephine, Tarrant again. I'm with MOJICA today, my relative and my auntie here, and we were just talking a little bit about her production, Chocolate Women Dreams, The Milky Way. And we were talking about layering, and kuna culture and traditions, and just how that really is a kind of cultural reference when it comes to the way that we layer pieces, and specifically in the way that my Aunt Monique works, which is right now she's did Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Way, and she's also been starting to shift her focus a little bit more on dramaturgy and embodied work. And so she was just explaining a little bit that really it's about finding these patterns, right? And so is that a little bit about your dramaturgy work? Is that really working with other indigenous artists into finding their own patterns, correct?
Yeah, helping people to identify what they're most drawn to or what within their own cultures carry that encoded way of how to tell, how to be, how to sing, how to dance, how to move, who you're related to, all of those things. The second piece that I created using this way of finding something that you can put in the center and build on was, well, it had two names. It started out as a large group of people, and its first title was Sideshow Freaks and Circus Injuns, which morphed into Izzy M, The Alchemy of Infreakment. And there I was working, and we're going to go back to it. My main collaborator on that piece was a Choctaw novelist and poet and playwright named Leanne Howe. She's now teaching at the University of Georgia. And because she's Muskogean, and because our other side is Southern Algonquin Powhatan, the Rappahannock, we decided that we would investigate something that we had, two things we had in common. One was that we come from mound building people, and we looked at those principles within mounds, effigy mounds, earthworks, and burial mounds that could be, again, transposed to building the framework of a story. So what we did, we went on mound crawls. We traveled. We started here around Toronto. There are areas, I mean, there's like 56 mounds in Hyde Park. There's 500 people buried in a mound in Scarborough. There's on the outskirts of Toronto, there's another very old burial mound, like 8,000 years old. And then there are places in the small towns. So we started here. I went to the Twin Cities, where there's in St. Paul, there's a like 6 mounds in a park there. And then from there, I went to Iowa. I met up with her in Cahokia. We went from Oklahoma and the mounds there across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and back. And we visited a lot of places. Then Ohio and Maryland. I wasn't able to get to the mound in that was just at that time being newly excavated in Virginia, because it's in some white farmer's field. And I called him up and said I couldn't just let anybody on it. Not just anybody. But we looked at so many of the mounds. I mean, they're different. They have different personalities, but we laid down on them. We listened to them. We sang to them. And we asked what we needed to know from them. And again, we had principles that came up. Let's see if I can remember them. Duration, frequency and alignment, integration and convergence and integration, in that order. So those were the things that when I built Izzy M, again, using fictionalized family stories, a fictionalized family story, and historical events that looked at. I started with the fact that my mom, your aunt, and Elizabeth were in the sideshow with the family and your great grandparents when they were kids. So I wanted to know, what was I carrying in my body from that?
Yeah.
One thing that my mother always says is that they're looking at me. They're looking at me like I'm a freak. So it's like, what is lodged in my body? And for me, I barely leave my house without somebody touching my person, feeling that they have that they are entitled to grab my braid, comment on my body. And in Leanne's words, she said, I wanted to get that gaze, that very pornographic kind of gaze off my body. And Leanne said she wanted to dislodge that colonialist gaze from her body. So that's what we started with. It went very far in different ways, and probably, because of grants and timelines and all of that, I had to extract the work that was directly mine. And we'll probably go back to that at some point and pick up, because she also had family history of circus performers. So, like, what is that? I mean, that is where, as performers, Indigenous people were relegated to circuses, Wild West shows, sideshows, and freak shows.
Yeah.
That's where we were.
Yeah, it's very
in some
interesting.
ways, it kind of feels like we still are,
Yeah. Yeah, in a lot of ways. It's very, there's this thing called it's on Amazon Prime right now. It's called Underground Railroad. I'm not really into it, if I'm being completely honest, but there was interesting. It's like a science fiction about the Underground Railroad. It's a little traumatizing to watch. Like, I can't really get, because it's like, it's one thing you watch. Yeah, when you watch something like 12 Years a Slave, it's hard to watch, but you're like, okay, but this is this guy's real story, and now they're putting this out there. This is like a fictional story. It's like, this violence is not worth this fictional story. But I was watching it. Me and my mother tried to watch it, and then it's like, instead of like the real Underground Railroad, it's like a real railroad that's underground, and me and my mom were it was actually pretty funny, because we were like, what? It was a real rail. Like, we really were questioning ourselves. Like, how did we not know this? It's not real. It's all fictional. But so it's all about these fictional universes and like whatever. All takes place in the South and during slavery, of course. But one of the things is that the main character, she gets free, right? And then the next thing, it's like her in a museum case at a museum somewhere in Georgia, and she's like picking cotton, dressed up like a slave, and then there's other people who are dressed up as Africans, and it's this like guy narrating like the whole story, like, they went from Africa, and he's telling this whole story about, I guess, slavery, right? But I said to my mom, I said, oh, that's very interesting that they went from like, not that any of this is based in truth, but I think just because that's how we think about it as well, right? Is that, it went from slavery into a different type of enslavement, right? So, which is the entertainment industry, which is in a lot of ways, and not that is what it is for us necessarily all the time, but there is a lot of that attached to it, where you're like, is someone interested in this, or am I just like a box to check off, or am I just something interesting to look at and examine and ask all the weird questions you've always been afraid to ask people? And that's like really a big part of it. And so, at Monique, even talking about like our great grandparents and, or my great grandparents, her grandparents and her mother, like, that's all real, and like, that's a real thing that we all live with, as far as like, intergenerational trauma. passed down through our very bloodline, and you do feel that, right? I mean, in some aspect, we are a part of the entertainment industry. Of course, we are all doing our own things, and it's not like, we are in a museum or doing freak shows or anything like that, but that was really the beginning, right? Exactly, that was the beginning. So sometimes it's like, it's a little scary, I think, for us, because you have to really check it all the time and be like, no, I'm doing this because I want to do it, because I think this is for every person of color in the entertainment industry. I think we are all always on that very thin line between the two, right?
In that piece, that thin line, we gave it a name. It was the tension between our invisibility on the land, like the mounds. You don't see them. You don't know they're there unless you know they're there and how to see them, right? And hypervisibility in the film, TV, and theater industries. As long as we reenact their stereotypes, as long as we support and reenact that genocidal narrative, that misogynist narrative, that colonial narrative that holds up their countries, then we are hyper visible. But if we define ourselves as we see ourselves, as we go through life living on the land that we are so inextricably bound to, then we are as invisible as those mounds, as the rest of the evidence on the landscape. So in many ways, that dichotomy hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't. It really hasn't.
No, it really has not yet. Like,
one of the things that I looked at in the creation of that piece and in digging around in Freak Show, was I many years ago read a book called Freak Show by a man named Joseph Bogdan. And one of the things that he said in that book was that Freak Show was the pornography of disability. And that really hit me, because I realized that all of these human zoos and ethnographic congresses and gatherings of weird and odd people and sideshows that our family was a part of was the pornography of othering.
Yes.
And that has not gone anywhere.
No, it is not. Okay, we're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to be right back.
People want to touch me. It's like, that's how it is on a daily basis.
Right. Hi, everybody. This is HENU Josephine TARRANT again with Rise and Thrive at USALA Media with Monique MOJICA. It's my auntie, and we're just talking a little bit about othering and freak shows into the and I think what the word you were using was invisibility, right? We're talking about the thin line between invisibility and hypervisibility, and which comes to freak shows or being used as a stereotype or support, all of these things that as people of color we really don't have a choice to be a part of are kind of impressed upon us. And that's what we were talking about, right? It was just people I guess what you had said was people trying to be by your person and trying to take a little and understand that. And I feel, we were just talking a little bit about our family's history, because it's a very real thing for us. Our family has been in the entertainment industry for I mean, I would say close to 100 years, right? 4 generations. Like my great grandparents, who were they were show Indians, on both sides, on my father's side and my mother's side, and on Aunt Monique on her mother's. Like this is how we grew up doing shows and doing that, and then breaking into the theater industry with Spider Woman Theater, who was our family, and then where we are as the next generations after that. So that's a lot of what we've been talking about today. I'm really happy I could have her today and talk to my Aunt Monique. She well, I think to close it out, I want to ask you a few things, because I always feel you're one of the people I feel knows their bodies the best, and I feel that's kind of rare. Because, well, it's not rare. I don't know how rare it is, but it's like you really understand your body, and you've really taken the time to understand how it works, and so much about it and how it should work, and all of these different techniques about the body, which is like super helpful. But also, like, I guess I'm a little bit curious where your interest came from that. But I'm also what I really wanted to ask you was, what is it that you do for yourself to kind of check in with yourself body wise?
Right now it's yoga and meditation. And when I turned 60, I stopped going to the gym. I said, I'm not going to work out like that anymore. I have to find a way of working out that protects my joints, that allows me to keep doing my work, getting older, but that is more holistic. And I was very lucky to find some good teachers. And the thing about yoga is that it really depends on the teacher. And I've never been able to meditate, and I finally have found a group of people that sort of I can do it. I can get there. How did I become someone who holds up embodiment and privileges in the body? I think it's because my mom put me in dance classes at age 3. So the body was always first for me. I also think I got more and more interested when I got pregnant, because, I mean, we also come from midwives, right?
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting thing saying, okay, how do you do this, and how do you do this safely, and how do you do this in a way that doesn't give up all your power to a male doctor, an obstetrician, in those kinds of very unnatural ways of birthing. And when I had an infant, the idea of giving that infant pharmaceutical drugs really bothered me. So that's when I started to. I was in a community in Buffalo, New York, that was full of Indians and hippies, on the west side of Buffalo, and there were people there who were lay homeopaths and naturopaths and herbalists. So looking at pregnancy and birthing and raising children in a way that felt okay to me, it just sort of kept evolving. And I found that being knowledgeable about the body, which you have to do in dance, which you have to do as an actor, I believe. Some actors don't, but I believe you have to know where the stories live in your body. You have to know what's going on. And then I was in 2 major car wrecks. So being able to heal required me to investigate how trauma gets lodged in the body.
Yeah.
And how in the world do you get it out? And understanding multi-generational trauma and epigenetics and all of that is, you can heal a lot of that. I mean, there's therapy, but there's also the body. Hello, the body. All of those things that you go and talk through, are lodged in the body. So just as a way to work through my own stuff, my own traumas, my own losses, going to people who were trained in those modalities, whether you're talking about traditional indigenous healers who also work in that way. They may call it something else. But things like osteopathy was based on Shawnee bone workers. And, I've had the privilege of being touched and worked on by people who are indigenous healers who move bones. We still have those things. So I think that knowing the body, working from the body, asking questions of the body is really foundational to my work as an artist. That's all. It's art.
Yeah, so much of Native spirituality too is so visceral. Like when you look at it, everything involves the body. Everything are these extremities or they're non-extremities of the body, right? And I think that's kind of interesting to think about. I always talk about her, I feel like, and I feel like I'm going to talk about her again on this. I don't know if I talked about her on here. Her name is Acacia Red Elk, and she's I think she's Umatilla from like Washington. Not exactly sure, but I'm pretty sure that's what she is. And she got into yoga, and like I knew her as a powwow dancer. She was like a powwow champ like back in the day. So I really always looked up to her. And she's like beautiful, and like she's always like was a really, really good dancer. She was like one of the originators of like contemporary jingle, but like she just took it to a whole new level. And no one had ever seen anything like that before. So she champed out all summers, traveled all around. And, I followed her on social media. And then recently she started to get into yoga. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, and, she would talk a lot about why she was studying yoga and what she enjoyed about it. And so recently I was a part of this thing I joined a free class that she was doing with Rising Hearts LA, which is like a native fitness group, but it's all native instructors. I was like, this is pretty interesting. I'd like to try this. And so I did hers, and it was so crazy because I had never really experienced yoga like that, right? Like I would only experienced yoga and acting classes, and then maybe some like, yoga for the people I would take for free every once in a while in the village. But I had never experienced like that. And I think, right, because I was so guarded too, because I'm like, I don't know these people. Like when they're talking about all this stuff, I'm like praying or anything. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. But it was interesting because you're in your own house doing it. And she did this thing called the seven generations. I forget what the name of it. 7 Generation Flow was the name of it. Wow. And she dedicated the first 4. Oh my gosh, it was like amazing. I was like crying afterwards. I was like, this really got intense really quickly because the first 4 flows were dedicated to your parents. Then it was dedicated to your grandparents, then your great-grandparents, then your great-great-grandparents. And then the next flows after that, the 3 flows after that were dedicated to your children, your future children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. And then it was just like so much like to really like think about and to like actually and to have like a native person do it. Like it was really amazing. That was the first time I had ever really associated yoga with like praying. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is how it all coincides together. Like, okay, I get this now, and I think about that when you talk about that, because that was something that she was talking about was like, as a powwow dancer, that like dancing is a visceral way of praying for us, right? And every time we're moving and what is that called? Your fascia is right. Moving underneath your skin on top of your muscles. Like that's literally like all of our intergenerational traumas that are stuck inside of us, right? That we can't, you can't massage it out. You can't, it's even praying it. You have to literally move to get it to move.
Prayer in motion.
Yes. And I think that's, yeah. All right. So I think we're going to get ready. Go ahead.
One of the first that I realized was after the second big car wreck I was in, I went to a physio who does the osteopathy methods, and there's one that unwinds fascia. And my body was going through all these weird contortions. I was in positions that I never could have gotten into. And I said, what is going on? And what the physio told me is that you are going through all the positions that your body went through as the van was rolling, but you're going through it backwards. The fascia is unwinding. And that was the first time that I realized that, oh, that means we can undo this stuff.
Yes. Yes.
If we have the intent, we can undo some of this harm. We can undo some of the, if you can unwind a violent physical event. Mm-hmm. And if all the multi-generational traumas are stored in the body, which we know they are, what is it that we can do to unwind that? And can we engage the vehicle of theater and performance to do that?
Yes. And I think that
flow on the stories, as it release in those stories and performance. Right?
Yeah, and you can feel that, right? So I think what I'm going to do is kind of, get ready to close this out. But one thing that I've been doing that I've been kind of liking the idea of doing is, asking whoever it is that I'm interviewing, what in one word or more, what is something what is a word or a sentence that you think could describe your joy?
Joy is a tough one for me. I think as of late, joy is being rooted to land.
Yeah.
Land and place.
Mm-hmm. Which feels like so necessary right now, like after a whole year. Well, thank you, Amini, for coming today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I really, there's a lot of stuff in there that I've never really sat down and talked to her about myself. So it was really great to talk to you and understand a lot more about your processes. I mean, we've always talked about it, but we've never talked about it. So it was great to ask you these questions.
We haven't done it yet. So
yes.
That's next.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, oh, well, maybe when I start working on Red Moon Blues, maybe I'll bring Aunt Monique back into this and we can get working on it, because that's something I'm thinking of. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, because, there's a lot of things that we could talk about. We could stay on here for hours, honestly, probably talking for real. So, but I love you and thank you for coming in today.
Okay.
We didn't even get to touch on her famous stuff. We didn't get to touch on smoke signals. That was our one thing we were going, oh, well, what can you do?
It's not theater.
Yeah, right, exactly. But thank you guys for tuning in this morning. And, I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week or the week after that. I hope you guys have a great weekend. I hope you have a great weekend, Monique. And I'm sure we'll be in touch over the weekend or, next week.
All right. Love you.
Take care, you guys. Love you too.
Bye, malo.
Take me out one more time is all you said to me.